Call this November 19th meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission to order. First agenda item is public comment. Anybody in the audience like to talk to the Planning Commission about anything? Okay. We'll move on to agenda item 2, Envision Eugene Land Use Code Amendment Update. We've got 3 code amendments to talk about: the downtown, farm animal standards, and single family. A couple of these are coming to public hearing December 11th. And to kind of keep on track, staff and I talked about how much time to allocate to each topic. Looks like probably about 40 minutes to the downtown standards, 40 minutes to farm animals, and then about 20 minutes to single family. So members of the commission, I'll do our best to keep us on track that way. Because all this will be circling back around to us at some point in the future, staff is asking for us to kind of keep a high-level approach to this, kind of give first reactions to concepts, give them guidelines to go forward, do our best to stay out of the details too much at this particular point in time. So with that, Steve, turn it over to you.
Thanks. So as you talk about these 3 different topics today, and kind of along the lines of what Commissioner Luddick just said, one of the things we want you to keep in mind is that the amendments that you're looking at here are all at kind of different stages of ripeness or readiness, and because of that, the kind of feedback we're going to be looking for from you may vary slightly. I think all of them are going to be a little more at a higher level, but some maybe even higher level because they're still in a draft stage, while others are moving toward a public hearing, as you heard. So we'll help walk you through that as well, but just wanted to kind of forecast that as part of the conversations. All of these amendments that you're looking at have been formally initiated by the City Council in one way or another. Some of them came directly as Envision Eugene strategies that we're now moving to implement. Others have come forward because of other political momentum that's been in front of the Council to bring these to the stage they are. As Commissioner Luddick said, some are a little more time sensitive because they do have a hearing date. Others aren't scheduled at this stage and still have a lot of opportunity to be reworked a little bit more as well. So again, some of the reasons why we may be looking for different feedback on some of those. The other point I just wanted to make real quickly is that there has been a substantial amount of outreach and or technical support that we've sought on each one of these, whether that be through formal subcommittee work that's been involved or other stakeholder discussions or technical experts that we pulled in to help us in crafting some of the draft language. So just keep that in mind as well, that there has been a lot of work behind the scenes that's brought it to this stage. It hasn't been just simply a staff project. So with that, we'll have each one of the presenters kind of walk you through that, and they can at least explain, I think, a little more detail, kind of the level of feedback, maybe even some of the specific questions we want to pose to you here for feedback as we move forward.
Okay. And did everybody get Rick's comments? He emailed comments to me and Alyssa and Christy.
Oh, I didn't.
No. Nope.
No. Okay.
Could we make those available to everybody?
Yes. We'll forward those back out. I didn't realize they didn't.
Okay.
I can even do that. As you start to kick off things, I can just go run copies right now.
Yeah, would you? That'd be great. Yep. Okay. So let's move into downtown. Nan, this one is yours.
Good.
And
So
let's.
you want to start? And
I'm
let's,
there.
why don't you give me these? I'll pass these around so you have something to
We'll
look
go till about 5 minutes to noon.
Okay, great. So Nan and I have actually, Christy.
10 after. About 10 after.
Okay. You ready?
Yes.
All right. So Nan, Lawrence, Christy Brown, and I
We're all
have
the
been the staff team working on this first set of code amendments that we're going to be talking about, and these relate to mixed use in downtown. And these come directly from a strategy and Envision Eugene to make compact urban development easier downtown on key transit corridors in core commercial areas, and specifically by removing regulatory barriers. So the point here would be to make sure that our code really aligns with the vision that's outlined in Envision Eugene. We have 5 concepts that were presented to you, and I'll give you just an overview of each of those concepts. And then Nan is going to talk more specifically about one amendment that's actually on a different timeline that you have before you at a public hearing on December 11th, and you actually have the code language in your packet for that particular one. And that, we'll get to that one in just a minute. So just starting off, all 5 of the topics all came from feedback that we heard during the Envision Eugene public process. Some of them actually we've heard for other processes prior to Envision Eugene, but all of these really came out of the Envision Eugene process. We met with a number of stakeholders, including property owners, neighborhood advocates, developers downtown, commercial brokers, architects and other designers, as well as the Chamber of Commerce, just to get their feedback on these concepts. So the code is not written at this point, and that would be our next step. But what we're looking for is feedback on these 5 concepts. You know, are they aiming in the right direction? So I'm just going to walk you through the 5. The first is to allow for. Oops, I better not stick my paper on top of that. The first is to allow for more housing in commercial zones. And the purpose of these is really to increase housing opportunities in our commercial areas and provide flexibility. A lot of times I think when people think of mixed use, they think of, you know, the residential over the commercial. And we heard a lot during Envision Eugene that we should actually, promote horizontal mixed use as well as the vertical mixed use, where you'd have commercial side by side with the residential. So these particular code concepts, what we're asking is that we allow for housing on the ground floor in our neighborhood commercial and our general commercial zones citywide. And then that second, in the downtown area, that we allow for 1 or 2 apartments. Right now we would allow multifamily, which is 3 apartments, but we would allow 1 or 2 apartments, say in an existing building that was unable to rent that space for commercial uses. It would allow them to do some kind of adaptive reuse for those parts of the building. And then one of the things we did hear from our stakeholders was, we want to make sure that suddenly our commercial zone isn't just being built with housing. We want to make sure that there's availability for commercial uses, so that we are proposing that as part of the Envision Eugene monitoring program, that we really monitor the outcome of this particular code amendment. So how much housing are we seeing and what types are we seeing in commercial? So that would be part of this proposal. The second concept would be to eliminate the trafficked impact analysis requirement within the downtown plan area only. Nan just handed out a site plan or a map that shows the boundaries of the downtown plan area, so you can kind of get that in your head. Unlike other parts of town, downtown actually has a lower adopted mobility standard, meaning we accept more congestion in the downtown area, and that's than we do elsewhere. It also, unlike many parts of town, has a well-established gridded street system, lots of connectivity. There's sidewalks and lots of lower and higher orders of streets and lots of ways to get around when you're downtown. Those are a few of the reasons why we are suggesting, and based on feedback, that we eliminate this requirement downtown. We've only seen 1 TIA, a traffic impact analysis, required downtown since the requirement was adopted in 2001. And typically TIAs are triggered when there's a high threshold of trips. So if that particular development generates a certain number of trips or traffic. So one, it's not something that we see often, but it has been raised numerous times as being a barrier, really just an unnecessary expense and expectation, because it just takes time and we really don't get anything out of it. The third is to provide flexibility for surface parking limitations in our C3, and that's the major commercial zone. So back in 2001, when we adopted the new land use code, or the city adopted the new land use code, the council adopted a requirement in an attempt to discourage surface parking. They required that you could only have 20 surface parking spaces, and anything beyond that was required to be structured. And this is found to be an issue for properties trying to redevelop downtown, particularly for the modest-sized properties. This is one that has been identified as a potential code amendment for even before Envision Eugene began. And I will say, we've heard kind of mixed reviews on this one in all of these previous iterations where it's been talked about and with our stakeholders there. Because of that, here on the proposed concepts, we're not recommending one necessarily, but we've kind of provided the range of options, which, from eliminate it to do nothing to there's a couple options in between. So we'd really like to get your feedback on this one in particular on where you think that one should be headed. The fourth concept would be exempting projects within the downtown area from some of the large commercial facility standards. The large commercial facility standards apply to new buildings and over 25,000 square feet. They have great intentions to them, but unfortunately they're really geared towards, well, unfortunately for downtown, they're really geared towards large-scale developments that you typically see probably more on the edges of town or larger greenfield sites. I mean, if you think of your Target or your Walmart, these standards are really geared for that type of development. So we have seen, just for instance, Lane Community College and the Woolworth building both had to request adjustments to some of these standards because they're just not geared towards urban development. What we're recommending here is that some of the standards be exempt for downtown projects. Not all of them, because we do think that some of them have merit, particularly those that require articulation and a certain amount of windows. And then finally, the fifth concept is to add some flexibility to our nodal development overlay zone. This overlay zone is intended to work towards having mixed-use development in these areas. It's applied to 4 areas across the city: Crescent Village area, Danabo, Lower River Road, and within downtown. There's only about 4 or 5 properties within the downtown that actually have the overlay zone. And some of the standards of the overlay zone have been actually, probably since we first adopted this zone, have been brought to our attention that because they're so prescriptive and they have that one-size-fits-all nature, and it is difficult some of them aren't adjustable at all, and some of them are difficult to adjust to qualify for an adjustment, that these properties are actually at a disadvantage, and it really restricts or limits their development. So we're proposing that you allow for some adjustments to the prohibited and special use limitations. Those are really, a lot of them are auto-oriented, and I think we would agree. We don't want to see RV sales downtown, but would it be, a large scale, I don't think we want to see RV or a large scale, auto sales or something along those lines, but would it be, so there is actually 2 tire stores downtown, and I think that means that employees that are downtown, if they do happen to drive, they don't have to go out of their way to get their car serviced. So just something to think about for that. And then second, we think that it would be a good idea to allow for some adjustments to the development standards for all parcels, not just those that have physical or legal constraints. So to be able to just provide a little bit more flexibility there. And this is where I'm going to toss it over to Nan, who's going to talk about one thing that was recently brought up by council, and this one is on a little bit more of a fast track.
First, I want to point out that in working on these code amendments, we have staff representing 3 different divisions. So I'm in the development division, Alyssa's in planning, Christy is in building and permit services, because we're really talking about where the big picture meshes with on-the-ground reality. And that is a good intro to the detail that I'm going to speak on, which is allowing, under some circumstances, drive-through uses for properties that have that ND overlay. As a result of council's action to direct staff to sell a piece of property for a use that includes that, the possibility of a drive-through, we realized that this is something we were already looking at, but in fact we need to move this one piece along on a faster timeline. So in keeping with the big picture, certainly a walkable downtown, but a downtown with high density and quality development, we worked to craft some language and involve stakeholder comments on this to allow drive-throughs, not by going through the adjustment review process, but to allow them outright if the development is denser and if the drive-through is not the primary use. So for that particular example, we're pulling this detail of the larger code amendments out, allowing that to go through separately. You'll have a public hearing on this item on December 11th, and then we're scheduled for a council public hearing just on this part on January 22nd. So it's really to keep your mind at the big picture level, but to recognize how the work that you're doing impacts property at a very detailed level as we try to move forward with implementing Vision Eugene. More back to you? Okay.
So I think we've said it enough times. We're just looking for some kind of high-level feedback, maybe some, your first impressions on these. Do they seem to be aiming in the right directions? More specifically on the one related to surface parking in the C3 or major commercial zone, kind of a little bit more specific on that particular one to see what your thoughts are in there. And then I guess that's all we have.
Okay, thanks. And before I open it up for comments from the commission, let me just say on behalf of the commission, a thank you to all the members of the stakeholders that participated in all three of these code amendment proposals for their time and their wisdom and their participation. We really appreciate that, of course. So. Okay, who'd like to begin the conversation? Okay, Steve.
I will if no one else will. So, do we want to talk about the specific, talk about one first?
You just go where you want to go, and we'll see how it fares.
Okay.
We've got about a half hour with this.
Okay. I have some concerns about number one, allowing, the way it's currently proposed, allowing more housing in commercial zones. What I'm concerned about is, right now there's a somewhat depressed commercial market, but as we add more housing, we would like people to be able to shop nearby. And I'm a little concerned that the changes we'll made here are going to basically force people to shop at a distance from where they are. So I mean, I preferred them. I have no problem with, on the same development site, having, housing horizontal here on the first floor, as long as commercial is next to it. For example, the across the street is a good example. On the same development site, we have commercial and residential. So, we're allowing housing on the first floor there, but basically the project itself has a mix. Now, and the reason I ask you, because if you want to take a look at this, now, the way I understand this does not apply just to downtown. This number one change is citywide. So I want to point out this map here, which doesn't show, but we have a lot of commercial and geo zone down here to 18th Street. And obviously what's happened is West University has developed out, and there are fewer and fewer sort of sites that are available at the right price. The units haven't been degraded enough to justify their placement in some cases. Unless we decide what we really want to do is zone this urban housing, I really don't think it's a good idea to say waive the commercial requirements. Now, I'll add a caveat to that as well. We've had continuing problems where you do mixed use, and somehow the way the code is currently written, you get to waive certain parking requirements for the residential. We have some projects, a good example is the one out on High Street around between 13th and 14th that has, I don't know, 5, I would consider them illegal parking places because they don't even have enough space, they stick out into the alley. In other words, they weren't the right depth. And I don't know, there's 7 or 8, 9 units there. 10 units, I can't remember how many units there. Maybe there's 12 units there now. But there was a waiver of the parking requirements because it was mixed use. There's 110 square feet of commercial space in that building that qualified to get these parking rights. So if we do this, I would like you to also address the issue with the parking requirements, so that we've had this discussion before, where we are allowing something to be considered mixed use that's got, so small amount it doesn't matter. Now, I suspect that there may be cases like in this area down here. Yeah, in this area down here, between what you would call 13th and 18th, that's zoned commercial and geo. And we've already seen we have a lot of pressure already going on in terms of housing going in there. We should make it clear, we're building student housing, so we're not building mixture of housing. So we're building student housing. And so if initially some of those projects sort of have to subsidize the commercial, I think that's okay, because in the long run, we want it there. We want those, those students. We have, a big project on Pearl, and it may take them a while to get that commercial space rented below. But once it's rented, it will probably thrive. You just have to figure out what the right business is. Because I don't think we want everyone to have to do their shopping out at Walmart or Bi-Mart or long distances. There should be some things that they should be able to get close. I'm talking a little bit too much. Should I keep going on other issues, or does someone want to break in? And I'll stop.
There are a couple other folks.
Yeah, so let me stop, and then I'll go on to the 2, 3, and 4 afterwards.
Okay, John?
Yeah, I'll just comment on number one. I may have been one of the ones referenced early there. I sort of feel that, first of all, the map only shows downtown, and if it applies citywide, it would have been nice to see where else it applies in general. Basically because in those particular areas, it's definitely not going to be as built up as downtown. But when one looks at downtown, which is where my comments came from initially, is that I feel that we're looking at walkability, we're looking at higher density, and if all of a sudden you're creating something that's 1 or 2 stories max, you're really limiting the future growth of what the downtown is supposed to look like, unless the vision of downtown is never having a building that high. So, and the fact that I was under the impression that a lot of these units they're talking about are condos, in other words, not rental units, but a condo built over a building, that would be sold, and therefore it would be very difficult to move to ever redeveloping that and getting into taller structures or a redevelopment structure that's more appropriate to the downtown at a later time. So I sort of don't like this particular issue as it relates to the downtown, but I don't mind if it's along other corridors which maybe aren't supposed to be as dense, or transit corridors, or wherever.
Bill?
And I guess my question would be on number 4. You were mentioning that 2 recent downtown projects, the LCC and the Woolworth, requested adjustments to the on-site pedestrian. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on what that involved, just to give a little better picture of
Sure. Just
how it didn't work maybe in their case?
Right. And just for background, an adjustment review is actually a land use application type that goes through planning director approval. There's a public notice period, opportunity to appeal. So it does take probably 3 to 4 months for somebody to go through this. And I'll let Christy explain, because I think she worked on both of those.
Okay.
So the standards actually require an 8-foot wide sidewalk on the development site. The land use code, it does not have an allowance to allow that public sidewalk, but maybe directly adjacent to count towards that. In addition to that, it requires a landscape bed between the building and that 8-foot required sidewalk. So if you think of, our downtown urban environment, when you have buildings really up against, the property lines, typically it's not conducive to that environment. When you think of Target and Walmart, as Alyssa had mentioned, those concepts in relation to those types of uses, it makes sense. I think that's maybe more the fabric of when those standards were written for versus downtown. And it pretty much everyone I've had to, even ones that haven't come to fruition, have had to adjust this standard.
And so what we're talking about today with even all 5 of these is within this black boundary here that's considered.
Not all 5. Let me clarify. Just some of these apply to downtown, and some of these would apply citywide to the commercial zone. So the one we're talking about right now, number 4, we're just talking about exempting downtown from certain of those standards, particularly those that require an extra sidewalk and extra landscaping. For instance, but the nodal development one would be for all properties that have the nodal development overlay, because that's citywide. The surface parking limitation in the C3 zone, the C3 zone is only downtown plus a tiny bit over by campus. And then the TIA would just be for downtown. And then the housing and commercial zones, I guess the first sub-concept would actually be citywide, and the second one would be just downtown.
Thank you.
And then Nan's, what she was talking about was just downtown.
Okay.
A little mixing and matching.
Yeah, I guess I have a general comment, and that is I'm confused about 50,000 versus lower versus hurry versus lots of time. You've talked about a number of issues, and I'm confused. So don't explain that yet. Let me get my other comment, and then you can respond. Related, and I've got comments for each one of these, but I'm going to stick to one, and then we'll move on, because I could get into much longer talk than Steve. On number one, I'm just looking at the proposed concepts, 3 bullets, 50,000 feet. I'm uncomfortable with the first one because I think you're going to dilute density, and it's not what you want to have happen. Second bullet, I think I see that, and I'm comfortable with it. Third bullet, I think I'm with support. So there's 50,000 level for number one.
Steve? Yeah, I just wanted to come back and circle around. I had this conversation with Nan before. It's one of the. I'm a little uncomfortable with number 2 also, and I'll try to be very brief about it. Why I'm concerned about it, because this only affects downtown. One of the problems we have in student housing areas is you need some sort of balance, some understanding between residents or whatever. And I'm a little concerned that what we end up with here is one 4 or 5 bedroom penthouse on the top of a lot of these places where there isn't any give and take between tenants. If you have 3 or more, you'll be building 3 2-bedroom or studio or 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. But if we allow all of a sudden the rules to change and now you can build 1 or 2, well, developers know that the system development charges are a lot less to build a 5-bedroom apartment than it is to build 2 2-bedroom apartments. So that's the tendency we have. And right now, what we're seeing is, downtown is becoming dominated by student housing. We have the high-rises on the other side of 11th that are pretty much occupied all by students. We have this new project here that's all by students. We have this one over here that's all by students. And what I'm concerned about is we already have a problem on the ground downtown. Now, just imagine what the public relations issue would be if someone drops a bottle or a can off a roof. And the problem that you have is when you have students without some sort of balancing, whatever you want to call it. If there are multiple apartments, then usually, one neighbor might complain if it's a little too loud or things get out of hand. And we know what happens when we have a little bit too much alcohol. It just, accidents happen. I mean, we don't want to create a situation where someone drops a bottle or a can off a penthouse downtown when we already have a problem on the ground from some other issues, or peas off a roof. You know what I'm saying? And this happens regularly in our neighborhoods. So we know that this is not like an uncommon thing. I mean, you can go through Western University and see the glass broken every weekend. And I just don't, that's why I say there's an advantage of requiring multifamily, because now you have 3 apartments. There has to be some give and take. The people know the other people that are going up the same stairway or whatever, or live in the same building. And so there's more likelihood to be a little bit of keeping things reined in. Whereas you have a single apartment, it's like a single house in Western University. You can pretty much do whatever you want as long as the landlord doesn't complain too much. That's my concern with that one.
I had thought Commissioner Baker had started number 2 on the TIA.
Or wherever you want to go.
Well, I don't want to get too confused just jumping around. It's hard for me to follow. I have some comments on number 2. Number 2 on the TIA. Basically just two comments. And one is the TIA is to manage and mitigate impacts to growth and development. And my first question with this would be, it didn't explain down here how they would manage and mitigate the impacts of this development of 100+ autos traveling there. Second, which really got to me, and I was glad the staff put it in there, when I read that there was only one TIA in the last 11 years, I'm saying, why are we even spending time on this? It doesn't seem to be a cost that's really prohibiting anyone. And I think if we are going to have a project that puts 100+ cars into the downtown, we ought to be able to take a look at it rather than say, well, we have transit. Well, if we have transit, we're not encouraging it by saying you can at least have 100 cars to begin with. So I think this is something that I could not support. I don't think there's a need for it, specifically on the fact in 11 years, one proposal.
Item 2, I could not support this. I think that the justifications for not having them are very short-sighted. And I think that over time, we're going to find that we're going to need to do traffic, and the street network is going to change. In other words, to say, well, we have it, it's already fully developed, yeah, but it'll change. There will be changes. I mean, we can't imagine what they are right now because we're mere humans, but 10, 15 years from now, we'll need to know. And I'd offer that this is something we need to keep track of. I know we're accepting higher levels of congestion. I'm a regular commuter through this area, and there's lots of traffic already. Could not support this, not even close. I could support perhaps creating a standard not static, but updatable model that models the traffic downtown that the city has, so they could do this, and that would take some of the burden off of the developers. So if we had a model, then we could just plug it in, instead of everybody having to reinvent the wheel every time they did something. We'd have something. Just an idea.
Are there any other comments on any other part of this proposed code? Steve?
Yeah. Again, I want to say, related to one, I'm all in favor of monitoring. That I have no problem with.
All in favor of what?
Of monitoring, but I don't think it's a good idea to change it from 3 to 1 for housing. When we get over here to adjustment standards, and I may disagree with some people, but for commercial, you can do a commercial PUD, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of adjustments when you do a PUD. Part of the problem with our code and why we're having to see so many things go to us and beyond is because we have these adjustments that are so vague that it's not clear what's legal and what's illegal. So I'm not really in favor of adding more adjustments. If we have a mechanism.
What concept are you talking about?
Well, we talk about adding adjustments over here to pardon?
Parking in C3?
Yeah. In other words, we don't give. We should have. If we had clear and objective criteria what those adjustments would be, that's one thing. But because we have a PUD allowed, they can do whatever they want. And then there's a site review. There's a whole well thought out process that theoretically that we have that allows you to adjust whatever you want. Because what we're seeing now is we see all these projects come in with ARAs, and then they get appealed. And sometimes they don't because you got to appeal every single ARA separately, so it's just prohibitively expensive to do it. So you just appeal one of them, and I just don't think it's a good way of doing planning. We have a mechanism that allows you complete flexibility. Let's use that. We don't have to add ARAs unless we've got a clear and objective reason, exact standard of how to do it. In other words, you say this can only be used by this this occupancy if it's over this size and whatever. So there's no concern about what the adjustment means. That's my take on that one.
We're running short. I'm going to make a comment on.
We're good till quarter after.
Okay. I'm still going to go ahead and jump to. I'll get there. Let's number 5. This is the one I think that's talking about drive-throughs, and this may have been the one that there's some accelerated effort on. And I guess the 50,000 elevation view that I have is I would be in favor of allowing more auto-related businesses downtown. I believe that saves miles driven because people do have needs they need to address for their automobiles. So I would not want to have that done at the expense of pedestrian or bike traffic. But I do think I think those things can be done consistently and symbiotically. My other comment is more of a set of questions, and it's on item 3, to provide flexibility for surface parking. I think this is the one where you provided some options. And I guess in general, I don't think that the requirement should be eliminated, and I don't think it should be retained as is. Okay? So it needs to be changed. Okay? Then I move to Number 4, where I'm not sure, consider limitation of surface parking, this is under option 4. Consider limitation of surface parking such as embedded or screened parking. I don't know what you mean there.
I can explain that very quickly. So the idea is you don't want to see cars, you don't necessarily be a pedestrian that just walks right by a row of cars. If there are cars on the lot, they have to be screened. You have to have landscaping in front, or they have some kind of structure,
Okay. Okay.
to get at your point about making it better for the pedestrian.
Right. And I guess I'm a very uneasy, and I don't quite understand option 3, where this word is all good.
It has to do with what's grandfathered. If a space has a certain number of spaces, like, let's say they have 20 spaces already, you're allowed to add 20 new,
Okay.
but you can't add more than 20.
Until you,
Okay.
unless you structure it.
That's just, yeah, exactly, unless it's in a structure.
I guess given the very brief amount of time we have to discuss this, I guess I'll stick with my original. It needs to be updated. It shouldn't be dropped. There has to be some judgment involved in what makes sense. The screened option, I think, has merit. I'm still not quite sure about the new versus the existing, and I'm going to rely right now on staff to figure that out. But that's where I'm at 50,000.
Yeah, since we're moving faster, number 3, basically, I don't feel that any of this should be changed. In attending the planning conference we had a couple months back, there were examples given of people on the 20 parking space limitation, how they worked that out, and it didn't prohibit their development. And secondly, in the handout that we were handed here, it's given the capstone project is building structured parking because of its large scale. Well, I thought that's the kind of things we're looking for, is large-scale development of the downtown for density increases. So I think that's something we want to encourage. I mean, I go on the news, I read articles. Other cities, they're building underground parking. I mean, why can they have the cost there and we can't here? So as far as I'm concerned, I think that number 3 should stay the way that it is. Number 4, if I understand number 4, it's only for the pedestrian limitation issue. Take it from that. Is that correct? That in number 4, what we're saying is that they'd allow money for the on-site development, or is it affecting other parts of 9.2173?
There were a couple other sections that we also are recommending that would be exempt as well. It would be the vehicle connections between sites, the interior yard landscaping when it's adjacent to residential, the delivery and loading facilities. There's a setback requirement if it's adjacent to residential, and since none of the downtown is adjacent to any single-family residential, we didn't feel that those were really appropriate to set the buildings back 30 feet from an apartment building, set the delivery and loading. So it's those standards that we would recommend.
Okay, so it includes other standards. You only referenced the Lane Community College Woolworth building, 2 big, nice-sized things that we'd like to see happening in the downtown. They requested adjustments. I assume they were granted. There is a process to take care of this without changing necessarily the code, since they were addressed. So I don't think there's necessarily needs for this unless they requested adjustments, and because of the code it couldn't happen, and it is prohibited. So that's my comments on 4. My comments on 5 on the nodal development overlay zone, I assume that's only affecting downtown?
No, those would affect all 4 areas, with the exception of the one that Nan brought up.
Crescent is one.
Yeah, I might have a bias here. I live in a nodal development zone. I bought there and bought a home in that zone, which is much smaller than downtown, because I did not want to live across the street from drive-throughs and/or gas stations, etc., and that was the selling point for doing that. If you're in the downtown and it's a huge overlay zone, I could understand that being singled out as maybe something that has different implications. However, I still have reservations on that one, because if we want to make the downtown walkable and having a lot of pedestrian traffic, and I'd like to see the downtown loaded with people, which would be fantastic if we put in the commercial things and the housing that they need, I don't want to have them stopping and wondering that every few seconds cars are coming across where they're walking for an entrance and an exit to drive-throughs. So I do have some reservations on this. I would think that I could see something like this in the downtown possibly, but it would only be in those particular areas that would be site-specific, and I don't have sufficient information to know where this physically would be located.
Other comments? Steve?
Yeah, just, I would feel more comfortable about the exemptions for 4 if they were, you mentioned the 2 projects that required them. Are those pretty much the only changes that you're making? 2 exemptions that they took, not anything else?
They had maybe a question about bike parking, if I recall.
Yeah, they did adjust bike parking, but that wasn't part of the large commercial development standards. Is that what you're asking?
So I'm just asking if the changes you're proposing are only dealing with the specific adjustments that they...
Well, the only other one that I would say comes up often is the vehicle connection between sites. Technically, Woolworth complies with that because they actually have an underground connection with the Beam building in their structured parking. LCC obviously is surrounded by public right-of-way, so that wasn't an issue on that, but that has become an issue on other sites, yes. So that potentially could be an issue.
That would be a project that spanned a street, for example, that wouldn't have the direct vehicle or just spanned an alley that didn't have a direct vehicle connection or something like that between the 2 parts?
No, the requirement is that for development sites that are on arterial or collector streets, you have to provide a vehicle connection between the 2 lots. So you actually have to kind of stub a vehicle connection. So that's been the issue. Sometimes, they're fully developed with a building even on that property line. There's no connection really to be made unless that site ever redevelops, but the requirement still requires it.
Okay.
If it helps, the original reason for that requirement came really from more suburban models for large parking lots. Think of Fred Meyer's on West 11th as kind of the poster child of that. Basically trying to avoid having to send people back out on the street to get into the next door parking lot, to have those connections between 2 large parking lots. That was the intent. It's a harder model to kind of visualize for downtown when you think of its genesis, so that's why it's on the table.
So anyway, that seems, the ones that really apply to suburban or not downtown, it seems reasonable, although I have to agree with John, if we had 2 and the adjustments weren't a problem, then it doesn't seem like, again, it's just a matter of where you expend your resources and energy. If it happens so infrequently that it, it might be worth doing, but you may make it a lower priority and do the other things first, so to speak, if that's one other.
We've got just a couple of more minutes left here, and I've got John in the queue.
Okay. I'll shut up.
Oh, no, go ahead, Steve. Wrap it up. Just leave John a couple of...
And Bill.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Mine will be quick.
I also have some questions about the nodal development. I mean, there's the general nodal development changes you're proposing here and the drive-throughs. I think I have to sort of straddle between my colleagues here. I think it's reasonable to expect that, obviously, banks, if you're going to locate a bank downtown, they're going to want to drive through because that's just, that's how we bank nowadays, through ATMs and maybe your car. And I'm one of the few people that actually still goes in the bank on my bicycle. But so I think that's reasonable. I just wonder, if you look at this, you might decide that you might change the wording so that it's such that, you've required a 2-story building. Maybe if you know that they're probably going to build a 3-story building, and this seems to be tailored for this particular case, and that seems reasonable, that would be associated with a taller building because or whatever. And so I think you could polish that a little bit more. I would rather see it, where you've got a building over it rather than, you got a 1-story drive-through. Okay.
John?
Bill was...
Well,
Go ahead.
I had you first.
I just thought we had some time, and I was going to give a generalized comment on adjustments. Let me just say that on adjustments, I'm always going to look at them very carefully when they're proposed in the code. Only because, to me, the connotation of adjustments were there to allow development because of unforeseen or some other types of very difficult things for them to do, on a very good project, they could come in, request an adjustment because everything else was fine except this, either extremely cost prohibitive or potentially not needed in their specific case. However, based on from what I've seen and what other neighborhoods are telling me, it's become like the status quo of how you do things. You put in a development and every development has 6 or 7 adjustment requests because the attorneys are advising them to do this. So from my perspective, I think that adjustments, which are supposed to be the exception to something, are coming the norm, not to do what the code says. And there is no limitation on adjustments, so virtually someone can be doing something in an R1 and because of adjustments almost build to an R2 or 3 because of what they're saying. So I'm just saying from this overview perspective that when we look at these kinds of things, I'm going to look very closely at why adjustments are being added to the code in certain sections.
It will become a balancing act. Using Eugene Pillar to have flexibility to the code, though. Bill?
I just had a question on 4, where you're talking about interior yard landscaping and delivery and loading standards, or delivery and loading facilities. The parenthesis says the change to not apply downtown when adjacent to R4. So am I understanding that you're proposing to relax those standards unless it's adjacent to R4?
No, actually the opposite. So what we're proposing is to exempt downtown projects from these standards.
So currently there's that standard if you're adjacent to
Residential, you have to be set back 30 feet, and what we're saying, change it so it wouldn't apply downtown to those properties adjacent to
just in
R4.
the downtown area?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So Nan, Melissa, Christie, you've got several comments to add to the mix of the stakeholder comments for your consideration.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now let's move on to farm animal standards, and let's target this conversation up until 12:55. And Christie, this one's yours. Congratulations.
Thank you. So as Councilor Liddick mentioned earlier, the City Council...
Commissioner, please.
Commissioner Liddick. Sorry, I'm nervous. Can you tell?
Not that I'm aware
The
of.
City Council did initiate a code amendment related to farm animals earlier this year, specifically in regards to allowance for goats. As you may know, they also suspended enforcement on the number of chickens allowed within the city of Eugene. So that's kind of the background. The purpose of these amendments is to increase the opportunity for urban farming on residential lands within the city limits. The proposal is to increase the number of allowed farm animals while addressing neighborhood livability issues. As you may know, this is implementing the climate change energy resiliency pillar of Envision Eugene. These amendments are listed as a high priority action in the city's climate and energy action plan and supported by the city's food security scoping and resource plan. Just to let you know, there is a Planning Commission public hearing scheduled for December 11th, and we're also looking to tentatively take it to the City Council for public hearing early next year. So with that, staff did develop code concepts based upon the city's food security scoping and resource plan, as well as review of codes from a broad range of other cities. Staff also met with several community stakeholders with expertise in the field. We really did try to meet with people on both sides of that. Obviously, there are a lot of people that are advocates on this issue right now, and we did try to also get a balanced perspective, you could say. It was harder to find, I will say at this point, but I'm sure more public comments will follow once the public hearing. Excuse me. So the concepts were also distributed to city staff to review to ensure consistency with other codes and programs, and legal review is ongoing. We do have some suggested changes, and that I'm sure will continue as the code takes its different shape. So staff is proposing to increase the number of allowed chickens, rabbits, and other domestic fowl, as well as allow an allowance for 2 miniature goats, 1 miniature pig, and 2 beehives. The impact this may have on neighborhood livability is addressed with such things as care for animals, setbacks, sanitation, noise, and containment of animals. Majority of the feedback has been very positive. I'm sure, as I said, there'll be more feedback as we go to public hearing. I think there's more comments are related to the numbers, where we've landed on the number of chickens allowed versus the number of beehives allowed, things like that at this point. I have talked to a couple people that have gotten, heard about it from the media and have called with concerns, and we're looking into things that we may be able to do to address those concerns. So it's a work in progress at this point. One of the other things that we've heard from the stakeholders is just the issue we're not allowing turkeys. So we do have a prohibition basically to roosters, turkeys, peacocks, and other similar loud fowl. Mostly thinking of the impacts in the urban environment and the cumulative issue when you're looking at a neighborhood and everyone having this allowance on a lot, not just specific to the lot, but maybe the block or the neighborhood as a whole. So those were something that was proposed to not be allowed. So those are things you may hear about. So at this point, staff would like to get your feedback on the proposed concepts, whether they seem reasonable for residential development within the city limits, and what your thoughts are, what your first impression thoughts might be.
Okay. John?
Yeah, and looking at the code, there were basically two things, over 20,000 square feet and under 20,000 square feet. Over 20,000 square feet, and my concept may be wrong, but virtually 20,000 square feet is 100 by 200 virtually. And if that's the case, and it also has to be an owner-occupied lot, then you're talking of something that's at least 3/4 acre or an acre in size for someone when they're doing these larger areas. So I don't initially have a problem with that because that's a pretty big area. The thing that I have my question on is it says developments on sites less than 20,000 square feet. Unless I missed it, I couldn't find a minimum. So are you saying that some of these things could occur on a 10 by 10 side lot or
Well, you're going to have, there's no limit, there's no minimum lot size.
So it could occur on a person's home with hardly any size lot at all, but they could put something in there because there's no minimum.
Right.
Okay, my comment is I think there should be a minimum, basically. Go ahead.
So the issue is the outcomes have to be met. So that's the thing to keep in mind is that
Minimum lot size.
You've got enclosure requirements and space from property lines and
Correct.
some other things like that, which are going to prevent it from being
Correct.
on very small lots, as I read this.
right, that is correct.
It's a question, I meant that to be a question.
Yeah, that is the intent, is that they have to meet the outcome. So, noise is an issue, sanitation is an issue, they have to have enclosures, they have to confine the animals, and they have to meet setbacks.
So if it helps too, John, we have minimum lot standards that apply regardless of animal care that are out there. So 4,500 square foot lots are a minimum lot size, for most lots. They're larger for flag lots and other requirements. You could potentially, theoretically, have a smaller lot that's pre-existing, non-conforming lot. And I think where some of the conversations are to go to is those are going to be difficult size, practically speaking, to probably accommodate much of this, given the setback requirements and kind of areas.
Yeah, I guess what I would have found helpful here that staff has done before is they brought in, drawings and said, this is what we're talking about. It would have been nice to see something that says, based on these standards under 20,000 square feet, you probably couldn't go smaller than this because with this, you require to have that, the setback. Then I would know what we're looking at and how it's going to impact a lot of residential people. I'm sure they'd want to know that too, and it might be beneficial at a public hearing so that they're not thinking their next door neighbor could have this right away. It's not clear.
Some type of graphic.
Yeah, that shows this is the smallest it could be on.
Situations, yeah.
So if I can respond a little bit, the thing to keep in mind is what we've heard a lot, like for an example, the miniature pig would be like a pet pig, a pot-bellied pig. So a lot of those would be kept in the house. That is the trend, that is the interest. So there's not necessarily a minimum requirement. It kind of depends on, are these pets, bunny rabbits, or can be kept in the house. Sometimes they're kept in a backyard. So it wasn't limiting it to having to be that, but then to say, if they had an animal, say for an example like that was kept in the house, to not allow it just because they have a small lot, when there's really no external impact. So that was kind of the balance that we tried to struggle with.
I would assume they could have an animal in a house if they had no lot, but I don't know that.
No.
Steve?
Yeah, a couple of concerns I have. I know the current code allows this in, R1, R2, all the way through R4. And I have a little, again, maybe there's some areas that are zoned R4 that are completely undeveloped and there's still a single-family house on it. But what I'm a little concerned about is we have, well, let's take the areas around the university, R3 and R4. We allowed them to build without any open space at all. So they don't even have
Party animals aren't part of this.
Pardon? Yeah, I know, that's the problem. They party in the street. So we know that very well. So again, that's my concern. So I don't know if there's a way that you could word this slightly differently so that sites that are already developed with multifamily in R3 and R4, say, you'd look at a little differently. Because I think we could really have some conflicts here between one tenant and another. It says that you have to own it. You have to be the owner, is that the...
Of the animals.
Yeah, but you don't have to be the owner of the property. So I'm a little concerned that, if somebody puts chickens out on their back porch of their apartment that sits right above someone else's back porch and,
But that is allowed now.
I know, I'm not...
It's not an issue that we've had.
Right.
So how our approach was to look at this is to not further restrict it, but to create greater allowances.
Well-
So just keep that in mind, that was our directive.
Right, but again, I think if you're going to change the code, then you should change all the things that might need changing so we don't have conflicts in the future. Because we haven't had it, we haven't had a lot of backyard, the chicken movement, whatever you want to call it, is relatively recent, so the modern chicken movement. So, and I'm all in favor of it, but I just think you need to think about some limits. The other thing even though the code now says in the R1 zones there's no limit, I really think you need to think about this. And if you give me time, I'll give you a short anecdote. Years ago, I was wanted her to leave, and the city wanted her to leave, because the problem is we really don't have a very good mechanisms for enforcement. So, that's just an example. When you don't have any limit at all, you can get a few people that, are a little over the top. So I remember meeting with them, and he drags in a deer carcass, throws it on the counter. Yep. I just want to, so I really think we should look at some maximums, now in the RA zone, I have no problem. The agriculture zone, I have no problem. But in the R1 and the R2 zone, I think we should have some limits. There are neighbors nearby, and they need to have some, reasonable, that way there's an enforcement mechanism. If somebody has 500 chickens, you can say that that's too many, whatever, some magic number.
Bill?
Actually, that was similar to what my comment was. As I was looking through this, we have limits on the numbers of animals and beehives in every area except if you're 20,000-foot lot or greater for the chickens, rabbits, and domestic fowl, on those with no limit. And I would suggest maybe having a limit. Maybe it's tied to the square footage, similar to the larger animals. If it's a X square foot lot, you need to have so many square feet per chicken or per rabbit or whatever. How you settle out on that, I don't know, but I just think there is a danger, I think, potentially of having no limit on the chickens, rabbits, and domestic fowl on 20,000 square foot lots or greater. I think the rest of it seems to make sense, and I think it's a good starting point. And I think you mentioned, Christy, that we haven't really had a lot of issues other than some of the enforcement issues, maybe with roosters and such. And so, this would be something that we could maybe implement, and then if something isn't working, we could adjust.
I've got myself in the queue, Jeff. My main question has to do with the sanitation part of the code. And it's simply because it's been too long a time since my family migrated from the farm country of Nebraska to come out here to urban life in Oregon. But I don't know what kinds of potential diseases or problems certain farm animals in close proximity to one another may present to the general public. I don't know that it's necessarily outlined well enough in the item 4 there, subparagraph 4 on sanitation, and I'd be interested if there's some public health stakeholder, member of the public health community that might be able to address the health of animals, if they need to be inoculated somehow every so often, or I simply don't know where it is. But it's one of these worst outcome things that I think the public might raise. What's the impact that, you go to the fair, you pet a goat, and then you get E. coli. And how prevalent is that, and what's the real danger towards public health hazard? And in a similar vein, on the care of animals in subparagraph 3, it just talks about, it mentions emergency veterinary treatment, and I'm wondering if there's a reason to distinguish between emergency vet treatment and just veterinary treatment in general for animals. Why limit it to just emergencies? That's my comments. Jeff?
Yeah, I guess I was going to ask a rhetorical question. I think I know the answer, though. If I'm talking about an R3 or R4 residence, and I'm talking about some of the new class of animals we're allowing, as in goats and pig, the enclosure for said animals would have to be some other enclosure other than the residence. Is that true or false?
The enclosure could be, I think if it's meant to be an in-house animal, like the pig example that we were having earlier, that could be considered an enclosure if they're
That would
kept
be the
inside.
same kind of expectation as a dog, for example.
Correct.
Would that also be true for the goats?
Well,
I'm just asking, where
wanna
we
go
go
in your
here
house.
is.
you don't.
You do not want to go to.
See that if there's space, you can have an enclosure right outside your back stoop or wherever it is, and you can have it, here's for this, here's for that, and we're all in compliance and everything is good. I guess I'm just kind of looking for that extreme case, and so that would be something I would just ask about. The other thing is that I assume this is all complaint-driven enforcement.
Correct.
And so once again, around those R3, R4, how those go, and I'm thinking of the more densely developed ones as opposed to, for example, an R3 that's got a single family on it because it hasn't been developed yet. I understand that. That's all.
Got myself back in the queue on 2 points. Follow up on Jeff's comment on the noise standard. It talks about frequent or long continued noise on a sustained basis during a 15-minute period. Is that language that's taken, like if a dog is barking too loudly now, is that the standard that you judge by?
Yes, that is the
You
same.
have to have line of sight, as I understand, with the dog.
Because my neighbor has one, and I just want to know what the...
I've been through this. I've been told I had to have line of sight on the dog or it didn't count.
Okay.
Oh, interesting.
Interesting, yeah. That is out of Chapter 4. That is my understanding, but it's enforced by.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then, I don't mean to be facetious about this at all, but on number 11, harvesting, it
Yes.
says only chickens, fowl, and habits may be slaughtered on-site in a humane and sanitary manner. You might consider reversing the clauses, which could imply that your goats and hogs could be slaughtered in other than a humane and sanitary manner.
Good point.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, it was just a question. The police, I believe, a different noise ordinance that's for construction and parties, and I think it's decibel-based or something like that, as I recall. So anyway, you might want to look at both of them and see if there's if it makes sense to merge them in this ordinance, because the police are used to enforcing that one. That's pretty common. So they're familiar with it. If there was a complaint, there would be a standard mechanism that they use. And I'm not sure about, like you say, this dog one may be on the books, but it may be difficult to enforce, maybe the way it's written. So just to mention that.
Bill?
Oh, and I think you did a great job here. I just think we're just trying to polish.
And then I guess my question, as we were thinking, in, let's say, R2, R3, or R4 rental situation, nothing in this would preclude a landlord from prohibiting pets or animals or that. So, if a landlord prohibits a dog or a cat or whatever,
Right.
they could still prohibit the
That
pet
would be
goat
a
and the
contract.
pet
And just to
pig.
point
But
out, that would be true if you had CC&Rs. That would be the same.
true.
Right. That
Okay.
would
So neighborhoods with CC&Rs, then if they don't allow that, this wouldn't
trump that.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a ration of unit and CC&Rs?
Well, it would depend on the
won't.
neighborhood. Yeah.
we
I know
won't.
my neighborhood won't. Yeah.
Farm animal CC&Rs. That'll be a new profession. You're right.
There are actually existing subdivisions that do prohibit,
Yeah,
at least
mine does.
chickens. Yeah, yours does.
Yeah.
Any other comments, John?
Yeah, I appreciate that for lack of a better term, the stakeholders, the internal reviews you had with different staff and everything related to this. From my perspective, it might have been nice if someone like from Extension or something just took a look at this from a perspective, not so much code, but being involved with animals all the time, what do they see in this that we don't real quickly that jumps out?
Well, we did have 2 veterinarians, one large animal veterinarian, look at these standards and give us feedback. Also, people in the community that are specifically selling or raising animals for sale, just to look at what seemed reasonable in that way as well. But the Extension, we did look at the website to see if they had recommendations, things like that. It was not as urban-oriented, so that was the only problem with that. But we did try, and then looking at other jurisdictions, of course, was a big component of this.
Steve?
Yeah, I think the challenge here is, whatever we pass is fine, but the challenge will be when there are complaints, and that there is a clear mechanism to how you handle complaints. I may say this with all honesty, Eugene does not have a good history of enforcements. Once you get through a permitting process, we don't have a good track record of doing enforcement. So I would really try to make sure that the language is clear enough that there's very clear lines of enforcement if there are complaints from one neighboring property on another. In other words, the chickens get out and get into the neighbor's garden and destroy the garden. So, because that's really going to be the problem. That's where you'll have the rub. If no one complains, it's fine. But when you have a complaint, how do you resolve it? And is the language here specific enough that you can do some sort of an enforcement, or corrective action?
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments? Well, that went quick, Christie. Should have an interesting hearing in a couple of weeks. Okay, thank you.
Give me a minute to.
Is that okay?
Are you bringing samples to the hearing?
Yeah, I did have one
You
last
might
thing
see
on
lots of pictures.
farm animals.
Sorry, Christie.
But just a quickie one, on the farm animals, it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
referenced that some sort of a notice and website was sent out.
Uh-huh.
Is it possible that I could get that again? I don't remember getting it.
Oh,
I'd like
uh-huh.
to have that, what the notice was and where the website is on this information concerning the public hearing.
Well, for the purpose of this hearing, I'll just let anyone know that might be watching what that website is. There's a short URL for it, so it's really handy, and it's www.eugene-or.gov/farmanimals. And so that will be a place that you can look to for upcoming hearings dates, when public comment periods are open. And there's a link to both the code concepts that you have in your packets and the proposed code language. And that will be updated as we're working through the process as well, so you could check back.
Eugene/or.gov.
Gov / farm animals, one word.
farm animals, I'm talking before that, Eugene.
Eugene -OR.
Hyphen,
Yeah, the normal site with a slash.
or.gov,
Yeah,
/farm animals.
yeah.
I can't.
It's the normal website, just slash farm animals. It's the way to think about it.
Fold it.
Thanks, Christie. Looks good to me, unless everybody can see that okay?
Okay, everybody good? Yeah, I think that's
Okay,
good.
let's move right into single-family code amendments.
All right, so our last topic of code amendments is single family, and really the theme here is encouraging small houses. This is been a very visual project, so for that reason, I have a PowerPoint just to show you a number of images. I'm going to give you a high overview of where we are with this package. I want to let you know it's definitely a work in progress, so we don't have anything polished for you, but I kind of just wanted to let you know what we've been looking at, where we're ending up, and some of the concepts that are kind of rising to the top. So today I'm going to talk to you about the approach, a little bit of how we got to the draft concepts, and then next steps. So overall, the goal here is to implement Envision Eugene, and one of the strategies here is to expand housing variety and choice. And that comes in two forms. First, making it easier to build smaller, compatible, and legal houses in the R1 zone, and then also to meet a portion of our city's 20-year need. So these code amendments fall under both the housing affordability pillar and the neighborhood livability pillar. So the goal here is to kind of find a balancing point between that. The code amendments that we have been looking at are, 1, allow for alley access lots and houses, 2, look for ways to promote secondary dwelling units, and then finally clarify the nature of accessory structures. A little bit backwards, but this is in an attempt to get more legal secondary dwelling units. In terms of approach, we've really tried to come at this with a very positive or best outcomes approach. These are examples of homes that I think most people would find, smaller homes that most people would find compatible. And what we've been trying to do is study what it is about these homes that makes them compatible in existing neighborhoods. What is it about their form and their structure? Why are these positive examples? And then try to replicate those. But you also notice they're all distinctly different here. They all have very different roof forms, entrance locations, different things about them. So also writing these in such a way that we could get different homes, that we're not going to get cookie cutter homes, but we're going to get compatible homes of different varieties. So that's really been our approach, is this, how can we get what we want, and what is it that we want, rather than trying to prevent some of the ugly examples. This is our process to date. We started with a lot of research, and it lists our sources of influence right there at the bottom. The infill compatibility standards is obviously where a lot of this came from, particularly the R1 and flag lot implementation group. We've also looked at a number of other cities, including Portland, Seattle, Santa Cruz, Boise, and Madison. We've looked at places in the Eugene Code where we've heard they're working, like Chambers and Jefferson West Side. There's some concepts there. We also, as the previous picture showed, looked at existing development in Eugene to see good examples. From that research, we moved into designing some design principles, and those really guide the code concepts. And then finally, the staff team, which includes Patricia Thomas and Christy Brown and myself, drafted some code concepts as a starting point, and then we brought those to our advisory group. And this has been, I'm going to have to pat them on the back. There's only 2 of them here, but this has been a fantastic group of folks, mostly that came from the R1 flag lot implementation group out of ICS. We had a lot of returnees from there, and then we added a few more members. And I just want to give them a thanks. And we had 2 planning commissioners, Bill Randall and John Belcher. We also have Sue Pritchard, who's in the audience. Steve Gobb with Rainbow Valley, Andrew Fisher, who lives in a friendly neighborhood, Chris Stebbins, who is a builder, Mike and Dane Butler, and then Mike Fifield, and that's been our advisory group. Their work is still in progress. Right now they're in the midst of refining these concepts, and they're doing a fantastic job. I just want to briefly then walk through high level what we're studying for each of the concepts. So we are starting with we started with alley access lots or houses. And those are, hopefully you can see that here, at the top of the screen there's a street, and in the middle there's an alley, and you'll see that the lot originally fronted both the street and the alley, and then was essentially the back portion was carved off, and so that is an alley access lot. It doesn't have frontage on a street. So we spend a lot of time talking about what would be the appropriate size and location. This isn't blow up very well, but these colored areas actually represent, this is on the south side of the river, they represent areas where these lots potentially could be located, and it's predominantly in the Friendly neighborhood. There's some areas in Amazon, South University, and Fairmont as well, but really predominantly in the Friendly neighborhood where there are a lot of existing alleys. These could happen. We don't anticipate that all of these would develop. It's more like about 25%, which would get us, I think, up to 60 homes in the next 20 years. So that would help with our single-family land need. One of the topics that we spent a lot of time talking about at the advisory group was an appropriate height. So what would be an appropriate height? So there was a lot of study of existing heights. This figure, for instance, shows the allowable height for secondary dwelling units, accessory structures like a shed or barn, and then primary dwellings. And so we kind of talked about what would make sense for this alley lot to have for a height. Another concept that was discussed a lot was the concept of slope setbacks. So to prevent looming walls and to also help with the height somewhat. The concept of slope setbacks has been something that has been a theme throughout these. And really quick, I want to give an appreciation and a thank you to our intern, Dijon Jones, back there, who has drawn all these. And I think that I want to say that they've been very instrumental in the advisory group when we've been talking about all these concepts. It's been great to have these visuals. Also, as part of the alley access homes and lots, we've talked a lot about the layout of the lots. So how do we make sure that there's adequate parking, but that the whole front yard or alley yard isn't completely paved? So, how do we find that balance? The same with home size. We want to make sure that there's an adequate size home, but we don't want the homes on these lots to be too big. Otherwise, it would seem to be out of scale with the neighborhoods. We also wanted to ensure that there was an adequate yard space for the residents of these lots. And so these just show, different concepts of parking and house layout and lot layout that have been discussed by the group. Now I'm going to move on to secondary dwelling units. Secondary dwelling units, as I think you know, are a second house that's on a lot that already contains a primary dwelling. And these are currently allowed in our R1 zone, and the intent is that they continue to be allowed, but we do some things to promote them. One of those things is not a code amendment, but would be to incentivize them by restructuring our systems development charges. Currently, the fees are pretty comparable to a primary dwelling, and that is seen as a disincentive. So there's a group looking at those. Once again, as you can see by these photos, secondary dwelling units come in a lot of different sizes and shapes and forms. And so, again, we've spent a lot of time talking about form and, what makes sense for these smaller dwellings. They're already limited in size to 800 square feet, and we're not proposing to change that. But in terms of compatibility for these, the discussion has really focused a lot about building height and making sure that they're an appropriate building height. And also, if they're, actually a lot of it would basically appropriate building height. And then the other thing, which I don't have any pretty pictures of, but we've talked a lot about, right now, one of the units is required to be occupied by the owner of the property. And that's something that the code doesn't have necessarily very strong language around, so we want to strengthen that requirement to define that a little bit more, because right now you could have 1% ownership and live on the property, and that would count. So we want to kind of close up the loopholes on that to really strengthen the ownership requirement. And then finally, this is one topic. Accessory structures is a topic that the advisory group hasn't made it to, but once again, I want to illustrate that accessory structures come a lot of different shapes, sizes, and uses. I mean, from your garden shed all the way up to your RV garage. So want to continue to make sure that these are allowed and, can be used as people need them. We have had issues where somebody built in their backyard habitable area, and then once they got their permits, they turned it into basically an illegal secondary dwelling unit. So we want to make that more we want to make it easier to do the right thing, to build a secondary dwelling unit, make it a little more challenging to build the illegal type. So that's really what we're looking at here with the accessory structures.
Is that a chicken, Alyssa?
Funny enough, it's a cat.
Oh, cat.
Couldn't find one with a chicken. That would have been perfect.
Very small pig.
Yeah.
That'd be a nice coop.
It's a miniature lion.
I think so.
So there's been a lot of common themes throughout the discussions with the advisory group, and as I mentioned, their work is not done, but they've been very thorough. But the concepts that have risen to the top are the use of slope setbacks, limiting the sizes of homes for both secondary dwelling units and the alley access homes, making sure that there's adequate yard space, and making sure that accessory buildings are really subordinate to the houses that are on the lots they are, and then to make sure that there's enough flexibility for creative designs. We've actually had a lot of conversations about some other cities' codes, as well as ways to ensure that if somebody has a great creative design but it doesn't quite meet the roof pitch, is that okay? And what process would we, allow that to go through? So that's all still a work in progress, and we'll have more to share with you later. In terms of next steps, I'm going to get your feedback today. Really, at a high level, the concepts are still in progress, so the numbers are, not set in stone at this point. So I'd really like to just hear more about, your initial reaction to these. Our advisory group is going to be finishing their review of the draft concepts in the next couple of weeks, and then our charge will be to turn that into code language and then go back out for review with that code language. So that's really where we are. Do you guys have anything to add?
No.
Okay. So yeah, I'd be happy to hear kind of your impressions of where we are with this. Actually, you know what? Before that, I'd really like if Bill had anything to share about his experience.
I was just wanting to jump in on
Okay,
that, so
I
I was going to get my hand out there. I, too, wanted to just say this has been probably the most enjoyable committee I think I've ever served on. The dynamic among the group is just phenomenal as far as just the interaction and the concepts and the ideas and those sorts of things. And so I have thoroughly been enjoying this. And when I was asked to go from the R1 team to also come on to this one, when I found out that many of the people were going to be the same, I didn't hesitate to say yes. And so I've thoroughly enjoyed that. I think a couple of comments and just kind of observations. One of the things that we keep coming back to is that these are a specific housing type. They're not intended to be single-family houses throughout the city. It's a specific type. They're small houses, they're infill, they're alley access, those sorts of secondary dwelling. It's limited in size and scope. And then I think the other thing that's been very helpful for me has been actually, Dijon, I'm going to kudos to you again, because we will come up with concepts and ideas, and he'll go draw them or try to draw them, and in some instances find out, well, that just doesn't work, or you couldn't do that anyway, those sorts of things, and it really helps us refine it in a way to where I think the end result's going to be maybe a little cleaner, a little simpler, a little more real, and I don't know, I think those are some of the takeaways that I have from it, but I'm thoroughly enjoying serving on this committee.
And because this is a work in progress, there's nothing specific coming to us at a scheduled time for code amendments.
Correct. I mean, there will be, but there's no public hearing scheduled. I mean, it's still pretty drafty.
But there will be a public
There will
hearing
be.
when that occurs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that the stakeholder group is about ready to wrap up its work.
Correct. They probably have another meeting, maybe two, depends on how the next one goes, so.
So what I'm going to suggest is that since you want to stay fairly broad about this, if there are real specific comments commissioners would want to make, they should get them to you
That would be fantastic.
by
yeah.
when?
Well, the group is meeting again next Monday, so it would be great to have it before 3 o'clock next Monday so that we could share it with the advisory group if anybody did have any specific comments.
Okay, the details.
Yeah.
So with that, John and then Steve.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Steve and then John.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Well, let John go first.
Do rock, paper, scissors.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm talking too much, so.
Well, on your attachment A, I want to compliment you on a couple of things. I think too bad that it isn't citywide. First of all, the building form should fit the scale and fabric and pattern of the neighborhood. I think that's fantastic. And the design of the existing dwellings on the lot and the primary design pattern in the neighborhood, I think that that's fantastic. And that windows and views from the dwelling do not significantly diminish privacy on adjacent properties. I think that's great. Too bad that doesn't exist in all R1, 2, 3, 4s for building standards. I did have a couple questions. One, the dwelling is inviting and directly accessible from the alley or street. I don't know why that's in there because it doesn't say facing the alley or street. All that means is that there could be a walk. Is that correct? And that the actual dwelling entrance to the house could be on the interior property? I mean, you'd never see it. Is that what that
That
means?
is correct, actually.
Okay, it's
And
just
the,
a
and the
walk.
group talked about that a lot. Staff had originally proposed that the house, that it have to face the alley, but I think what the consensus of the group was, different alleys have different characteristics, and there might be an alley where you don't want your front door on that alley, and so that there should be some flexibility about where that, where that front is. But I believe that they did want a pathway that would go to that would lead to the front door.
Okay, I understood that. It's just
Yeah.
that when it said "and recognized entryway," I don't see how it could be recognized if it's off to the side or back. But anyway, hard to say. Attachment B, page 2, doors, windows, and balconies. Limits on an upper floor outdoor space to be at 10 feet from interior property lines, not including the alley property line. So my question there was, well, how close could it be on the alley property line? I mean,
There's a 5-foot setback from the alley property line for any structure.
so that's in there even though it's not in there. It's implied from somewhere else? So I thought
Right.
you were rewriting.
Right.
Oh, so you're just this will overlap.
So alley
Certain
access
existing-
lots actually aren't allowed currently, so anything in here would be, our charge was to come up with new standards since there aren't any. These were previously allowed prior to 2001, but they didn't have any design standards or compatibility standards with them, so our focus here has really been those compatibility standards. So if you bump down minimum building setbacks, there's a 5-foot setback.
Yeah, 5 feet, okay. And I guess my last comment, utilities are required to be underground, and you're saying allow overhead in some cases? Mm-hmm. What was the reason for that?
One, help me out, Bill and Christie, but I think one, in some neighborhoods, when some of the older neighborhoods, the majority of the homes are already served by overhead, and it can be anywhere between, I want to say, $2,500 and $8,000 to underground these. So a lot of because we're trying to promote affordable housing with these, that gets to be pretty expensive.
And so if you're in an area where everything is overhead, to develop an alley access lot, which is a smaller lot, smaller house, trying to be more affordable, to then, we're even looking at SDC charges on SDUs, trying to encourage this, but to add that requirement of going underground on the utilities could be a cost issue.
I thought it was current, already current.
For new development.
New
Okay.
develop, yeah.
New development sort of out.
Okay, and the only reason it triggered me again is I do that almost like adjustments. Are adjustments allowed on everything I'm looking at here?
Yes, and that was part of the flexibility. That is our one mechanism to allow for flexibility. But I think you did bring up a good point, is that some of our adjustment review standards don't really link well with what's being asked to adjust. And so what the group has talked about here is making sure that whatever standards you use whatever criteria you use to evaluate the adjustment actually makes sense and relate to what's being adjusted.
Well, my concern is like, you talk about dormers and setbacks. Well, someone comes in and requests an adjustment to that. Is that permitted?
We haven't got, like I said, we're still in.
Well, I'm saying it
but-
shouldn't be. I mean, I'm saying there should be certain fixed standards that don't permit adjustments and adjustments for certain other things, just like the telephone wire. That's all I'm trying to say. That makes sense to be able to have an adjustment, but just to have an adjustment permitted under that code opens everything up, which to me I have a problem with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Steve?
First, I want to thank you for finally getting to this ICS, and I really appreciate all the people in the past who worked on these issues. Just a correction, I understand that alley access lots are allowed in the heritage neighborhood, is that correct?
They are. They're not allowed in the R1 zones currently.
Right,
But they are, they are allowed in the two zones that I referenced earlier, both
Right.
the Chambers and the Jefferson West Side special area zones.
So just wanted to make it clear that we do allow alley access lots in some special area zones where you, a couple of suggestions, just in that regard. I think it would be useful whatever you do come up or propose, compare it to what the standards that were adopted for the heritage neighborhood, for example, which was the latest one, or you can compare it to the older one. But I think you should compare your standards to what the heritage, just to see maybe there's maybe they're going to be very close, or maybe we'll find some things that we might want to change later on in that area if based upon what you find on the ground a few years from now. But that way you have a comparison and we see that they're similar.
The good news is we did that. So
okay.
they were actually one of the things that influenced these code standards.
Right, but
Some of
it-
these are actually based off of those.
Well, yeah, it's obvious, but I mean, it would be useful to have the direct comparison so people could see that, this isn't the same. So we've already been over this before, and so there's not really, you don't have to consider it in the same level of detail. And this is where we're making a change, and maybe we'll look a little more closely at that one. The other thing I want to mention, because it's a problem, this becomes a problem in alley access lots. When you have parking parallel to the alley, it's not a problem. But when you have parking perpendicular to the alley, our current parking standards allow compact parking spaces everywhere. The problem is you have a pickup truck and you park it in a compact space, it sticks out in the alley. And these are narrow right-of-ways already. So I would suggest that you handle this the way we did in the multifamily, that when you have parking spaces, and you have, parking areas that are perpendicular to the alley, that you require the 18-foot depth rather than the 15-foot depth, just to minimize those kinds of problems. Because we still have garbage trucks and everything else goes through those areas. And it's just, you can imagine a situation where you could have an alley access lot on one side and the alley access lot on the other side, and there's two pickup trucks, and you can't get a garbage truck between them. And, and not only that, you can't back out and turn around very easily because it doesn't meet the minimum. My colleague here is the traffic expert, but as I recall, I think it's 18-foot separation between parking lanes, and we have a 14-foot depth, so if we let cars park right up to the edge, you don't have enough, you've got to back in and out a whole bunch of times to be able to get the car in and out. So we don't want to create problems where we'll disrupt. And just to mention personal bias, but from experience, EWEB is not gung-ho on undergrounding utilities in existing neighborhoods. I mean, I wish they were, but they avoid it like the plague. I would suggest, though, because we tried to I give this as an anecdote because maybe there's something you can do in the conversations to talk with them. Obviously, in the long term, long view, not 10, 50 years, we need to underground our utilities. Every time we have a power storm, we basically lose all kinds of stuff, and there's problems. So when a pole falls, we had that big pole fell on the other side of the river, in the north side of the river a while back, and it went right through the middle of a building. I'm talking about a high utility pole, but when we it's really advantageous, if possible, to pave alleys that have a lot of traffic. It's not justified in the R1, but it does really help a lot of things, like bicycles can travel through the neighborhood without having to be on streets, and the conflicts with cars are much more reduced. So when the city required, with our instigation, our neighborhood, to pave all the alleys in West University, which made sense, we're R3 and R4, I tried my darndest to get EWEB to drop conduit in underneath these nice brand-new 7-foot, 7-inch concrete on, commercial base and all that. And we couldn't get them to do it at the time. I mean, we would have, the cost was already taken care of by the alley. All I had to do was give us the pipe and we put it in. So, but I would see if you couldn't work out some relationship that if you are going to pave an alley, that you try to work with EWEB and get some conduit in place. They still have to put the boxes where the transformers go. But the point is, we're eventually going to underground this community, not in our lifetimes, but sometime. And if we plan ahead, it's just a lot less expensive. I mean, there's lots of jurisdictions in California that have just done this. But, because otherwise what it means is you're going to have to tear up everything you build to put in, underground utilities when you finally do it. So those are my comments.
I've got myself in the queue. Notice in the staff report it says during the advisory group's discussions, the issues of looming walls, incompatible building heights, loss of privacy were a common theme, something that we hear over and over and over again. I'm kind of curious. I don't see in the design principles talk about setbacks, particularly rear lot line setbacks. And I noticed that in the proposed codes, it maintains basically the 5-foot interior setbacks. In this whole privacy thing, we hear about particularly established neighborhoods or where infill occurs, and the next thing you know, there's a building right, exaggerate a little bit, right on the lot line, 5 feet back. Why wasn't that?
Well, I'll let Patricia talk about the design principles a little bit, but in terms of the concepts, I mean, the way that those were addressed were, one, the second-story windows have to be set back in.
Yeah, I understand.
So that was the setback there. And then it's really the looming walls, from what I understand, was kind of the bigger issue. So if you can have that really tall wall with those windows right there, that was really where that loss of privacy. But with the single-story building, there was less concern because you can't really see into the neighbor's yard. So it was we really dealt with that through the slope setback and then the building height itself and then the requirement for the dormers or any kind of upper story windows to be set back.
We're talking about limiting the overall height of these substantially less than what the primary dwelling heights would be.
And not approaching it from an increased setback on the lot line.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've got that too, because with second floor balconies, we're proposing.
Not the lower floor.
Not the lower floor.
Yeah.
I think the design principles are more general. They are guides for what the outcome, what, that's about the pattern, the scale, being subordinate to other structures. But we recognize and part of the desire for some adjustability, whether you use that term or not, in the end, is that creating a good development on any particular site isn't necessarily going to result from a menu of requirements, and that a setback of 5 feet versus 10 may not make the difference in some place. It may be the tree, it may be the focus of the windows, it may be that recognition of it being part of a community. So we're trying, as principals, to think about that holistically, and then the group so far has not focused in on setbacks, but it might be something that gets more attention.
Well, this is what I don't understand. When we talk about pattern and fabric of a community and the character of a community, I forget which particular neighborhood it was, but I remember the Planning Commission receiving some very detailed measurements about lots and front yards and backyards and all that. And if you have a neighborhood where the typical home structure is 15 or 20 feet from the backyard, and that's consistent throughout the neighborhood, then I guess what kind of bothers me is that when the new structure is allowed within 5 feet of that fence, it does something to the fabric and the nature and the whole character of the neighborhood. And that's why I'm surprised that it wasn't wasn't discussed more.
So a need for more spaciousness to reflect what that.
Personal opinion. That, as you know, this is my one thing that if I could take care of. Yeah. Steve?
Just a quick one, too. Normally, you allow some adjustments, so you can go from 5 to 3. Is that still the case, or are you going to make adjustments not allowable on the side yard lots?
You know, there was talk about allowing, and you can go to 3, well, you can actually go to less than 3 if the neighbor is okay with it. So you can either be set back 5 feet, or if there's 10 feet between structures, you could move closer to that property line. Is that, do I have that quite?
With the maintenance act.
Yeah, with that neighbor's permission. So there is talk about allowing that, because once again, what if there was a beautiful tree on the other side that everybody in the neighborhood would want you to save, that's in where you'd need to build a house? If you could move it over a couple of feet, get you closer to the neighbor, but the neighbor's fine with it. So just to allow some flexibility.
I thought you could also adjust based on firewalls. So in other words, if you built that wall as a firewall, you could have an adjustment, intrusion, I guess we would call it. So we're not allowing intrusions on the side yards, or we are?
Well, our current requirement allows, basically, it assumes you would have 5 feet and 5 feet on either side. It allows you to have that total of 10 feet slide, basically, between the buildings. Or you can, in some cases, have actually attached homes, which gets into the building code questions, but nothing really in between.
Okay, what about intrusions? Because normally we allow
Right.
intrusions into that 5 foot.
Right, so the intrusion would be that sliding 10-foot that I'm talking about, would allow you to come further. Plus, you have overhangs and other things that are allowed within that setback.
Well, we allow bay windows and things like, in other
Right,
words,
right.
and they base could go to all the way to ground. So you can have an intrusion that's not really it's in the setback.
Right, there are certain intrusions that are allowed in the setback, right.
So-
Chrissy can answer.
For
that.
alley access,
What
we're
those
just,
all are.
yeah, for alley access, we're saying that you could only have eaves and chimneys.
Right.
Would be
Okay,
the
that's what I was clarifying, that you couldn't have intrusions.
No, that was what I was going to say. I was going through our chart.
I know, I was like trying to find that.
Remember talking about that, but yeah, it's just eaves and chimneys.
So any other general comments? Remember, specific recommendations to Alyssa real soon, but any other final general comments? John?
Yeah, I just didn't quite understand the last thing on non-conforming. Non-conforming, I understand allowing it to be there, but when does it have to conform to the new standards? Is it by a percentage of rebuild, or is it they're updating the code if there was water back there? The very last page, I can understand that they're exempt from meeting these standards, but when do they have to meet? In other words, if it burnt to the ground, I assume they have to meet it, but do you have like a 50% that says they have to meet it, or?
So I can answer that. The code has a legal nonconforming provision, so that would assume that the structure was legally created and is nonconforming to our current code. The issue of this, where this comes in, is actually allowing nonconforming structures that were not built to be SDUs. Pardon?
Which are you on page 8, the very last
On
page?
the very last page.
Okay, because I think all of them
There's
have a
two.
little bit, yeah, so go to the very last page.
I'm just wondering, does it ever have to meet the standards? If A, it burnt down, or 50% of it, or if the person said, I'm redoing so much and I'm...
He just, he wants
All right. So the rebuild piece is that if it is damaged, not owner intentionally caused, 50% or greater of the value, it can be replaced. And that's true for any structure, as long as it was legally created. So there's that piece that, we are obviously, this would be subject to as well. This was exempt from the meeting. These standards are considered legal. This was a whole nother discussion that we had about incentivizing conversion of existing structures. So that's part of another part of this new discussion.
You can have non-conforming structures, but you
Right.
can also have non-conforming uses.
Right.
So there's two different realms that we deal in. If that, so some of this
So
is
the
conversion.
use is what requires these standards. It's not the structure that it's requiring, it's the use of the structure that requires these different standards. So the use is as a dwelling, secondary dwelling unit. So that's the thing to remember. The other piece of that is if you have an existing detached shop or garage and somebody wants to repurpose that to be an SDU, we are looking at is there going to be some allowance for them to do that, to reuse that existing structure and not comply with the standards? So that would be a new piece. Does that make sense?
So let me give an example, and you tell me if this doesn't fit. Somebody built a storage shed, garage, let's say it's an RV, was an RV storage area. That structure doesn't meet the current code now in terms of setbacks. They come to the city, but it was built legally and it was fine. So it's fine, it can stay as is. Now they come to the city and say, I want to repurpose that. I want to actually remodel that existing structure and the interior to make it habitable space for a residence, not to use as storage anymore, but now as a secondary dwelling. Would we then make that structure conform to all of our current requirements? In other words, you'd have to tear it down and rebuild it.
Basically.
If, let's say, it's too close to the property line. Could they even propose that to begin with by changing the use?
Right, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
And would they have to meet the new standards? That's what I asked.
And I think what the group is looking at is, should there be some flexibility? I don't think they've answered it yet.
No, we haven't answered that one.
Oh,
So you're asking the same question they're grappling with right now is, would that be reasonable to allow some flexibility for an existing structure to remain as is, but to be repurposed without having to meet all the current standards? If you're not changing the physical structure itself.
my comment would be, I would like to see it have to meet the new standards. The same way if you're updating code things for plumbing and this and that, you have to meet the new standards. So it would seem to me we need to be consistent.
Steve?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, I noticed you have a setting, a table entry for solar access standards for the SDUs, but I really think that you should have solar access requirements for all three of these categories. It doesn't seem like, these are R1, but they're smaller than the square footage that would normally trigger that, and I think, given that these are small size, there shouldn't be any reason that they can't meet the solar access standards. I mean, we certainly don't want to have an alley access lot come in, and because of the way it's, whatever it is, block the solar access to the property adjacent or whatever. And the same thing with, even more so with accessory buildings that, you usually have a lot of flexibility about where you put that on the lot and so forth. We certainly don't want to have somebody, because we have a lot of examples of where they did that. Someone came in and built an accessory building illegally, right? And they've actually occupied it as housing, and it was built such that it didn't comply with the solar access standards. So I would put I guess, a row entry for solar access to all three of these, and to make it clear how they apply or they don't apply, so we can discuss that.
Any other final comments? So many more comments to add to your list. Alyssa, Patricia, Christie, thank you.
Oh, that's helpful.
Staff, comments from staff?
Nope.
Comments from commissioners?
In general?
In general?
Yes. Retreat. We are going to be meeting to start talking about topics and ideas that we want to discuss at the retreat. The retreat will hopefully be sometime early after the first of the year. But the committee, we're going to be meeting, and so I would appreciate any topics you would like to see us consider for the retreat. Email me with those. I would appreciate that. We're going to be meeting as a committee the 7th, and so if you could give me just what your thoughts and ideas are. We've got a couple already, and Jeff, you want to jump in? And
Well, just that I was going to suggest we put a little email out since Rick.
Oh, good idea.
Here, so that
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
solicitation
good
by
point.
email.
Good
Good
point.
idea.
Good point. Yeah, I had thought I'd bring it up today and didn't realize they
Thanks,
wouldn't
Jeff.
be here yet. I'll do that.
Other comments from commissioners? Just as a reminder, on the Dearborn appeal, Becky Taylor was hoping to get questions by close of business today. I realize there's a lot to consider, but for her to help her out a little bit. Our next meeting is a week from today, Monday the 26th. Envision Eugene updates. And Steve, it says we're meeting here.
Yes. Until noted otherwise, we're meeting here.
Okay, we're meeting here. And other than that, I hope you all have a safe and enjoyable Thanksgiving. This meeting is adjourned.